this seems to be an escalation in Ofcom's kind of ongoing scrutiny and hostility towards GB News, because this is the first time Ofcom is considering a statutory sanction. So it hasn't imposed a statutory sanction before. In every previous case, it's just been a wrist slap, no fine, nothing. This time, if they decide there's a kind of like a 2-month process in which they decide whether a statutory sanction is appropriate, and they say it could be. In this case, they haven't decided yet, but it could be because, first of all, breaking this due impartiality rule, number 5 in the Broadcasting Code, is more serious than breaking some other rules. And it's the third time they've committed this offence, according to Ofcom. So the first time was, I think, Esther and Phil interviewing Jeremy Hunt, 2 Conservative politicians interviewing a Conservative Chancellor. And the other time was Martin Daubney standing in for Lawrence Fox when Lawrence still had a show, and interviewing Richard Tice about, I think, about Rwanda or something. So they say it's the third offence. And a statutory sanction can range from a fine to suspension of GB News's broadcast licence. It probably won't be that. It'll probably be a fine, if that. I spoke to Ofcom about it yesterday because I've written about it in the Spectator this week. And yeah, I mean, to deal with the point you referred to, which is that GB News should have been particularly fastidious about observing this particular part of the Broadcasting Code because we're in a pre-election period. I mean, that's just nonsense. I was on Jacob Rees-Mogg's show on Monday to talk about this. The person putting the case for the Ofcom was Michael Crick, and we joked beforehand that if we both approved Ofcom's decision, Ofcom might then sanction Jacob for not having a balanced discussion about Ofcom's decision. But anyway, we didn't. He was opposed to it, and I was. He was in favour of it. I was opposed. But at one point Jacob made was that since the repeal of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, given that it's now back in the gift of the PM to call an election whenever he wants, you could describe any period in British politics as a pre-election period. I mean, who knows when the election's going to be? I mean, it's one thing to say that you have to be particularly observant of this particular rule during a general election campaign. Fair enough. But to say, well, we're not in a general election campaign, but this is a particularly febrile pre-election period in which the election is going to be within the next 12 months. It was that they were inventing this kind of concept in order to kind of rationalise being more heavy-handed, taking the gloves off this time. The stuff about kind of, a broad range of views being given due weight and so forth. Well, if you watch the programme, there were a broad range of, anti-conservative views expressed. Rishi was criticised for the Rwanda policy, probably not going to work. A trans person got up and said, why should members of the LGBT community vote Conservative? What have you done for us? There was a criticism for not building more houses. And when I put this back to Ofcom, they said, yes, but the questioners weren't given an opportunity to follow up and criticize Rishi's answers. And the presenter didn't do enough of that himself. But, GB News wanted to prioritise giving as many members of the studio audience an opportunity to ask a question as possible, over and above giving, a handful an opportunity to cross-examine Rishi Sunak. I mean, why is that a breach of impartiality? It wasn't as if, he got off lightly. As you say, if you watch the programme, it looked like he was torn a new one. And as for the presenter not kind of asking follow-up questions or, subjecting his answers to more scrutiny, well, in fact, he did. On Jacob's show on Monday, they showed the presenter doing that at least 3 times. But in addition, it seemed to be a complaint that Rishi wasn't interrupted enough. The audience and the presenter didn't give an opportunity to interrupt him often enough. But actually, the constant interruption of senior politicians when they're on the television or the radio is actually something, most people really intensely dislike. They want politicians to be given a chance to set out their stall so they can make, informed decisions. So that seemed to me to be ridiculous.
Yeah.
It does feel like, Ofcom pretend that it's a purely kind of quasi-judicial decision in which they're just adjudicating, they're just examining whether GB News broke these rules, and then there's no political bias at all. But actually, they have so much discretion, so much latitude in deciding why should breadth not be okay, but depth be okay when deciding whether whether people are given a chance to express kind of a broad range of views and so forth.
Yeah,
I mean, it feels a bit arbitrary, and so what's the explanation? It must be because Ofcom knows which way the wind is blowing, and it's, well, we're going to have a Labour government soon. Let's do something that's going to please our new political masters.
Okay, well, you've spoken for so long there that we're in danger of breaching impartiality, so let me just come back, because that's what they're complaining about. Ofcom themselves on their X said, our investigation took into account the audience's questions to the Prime Minister. While some provided criticism, audience members were not able to challenge the PM's responses, as you say, and the presenter did not do this to a meaningful extent. Then they said, here are our findings, right? And they had this sort of pedantic list, and it ends up just looking to me like people who don't have to make TV programs, just with a list of annoying complaints like anyone could have about our podcast or anything. Like, here's where it could have been better. It's like, what are these? Like producers' notes, like, you know, like producers ruining a movie or script or something. It's like, try and make something. You know, I know it's also politically biased, and that's the main point. That yes, they can just attack GBNews, and they like doing that, and there's a lot of popularity when they do that. A lot of people trying to get them to do it, activists. But there's just this other funny element. There's just like, actually, this is just. That the show you want would be impossible. It's kind of like the Oscars. No, 35% have got to be from a BAME lesbian, but it's like that's not how art's made. And similarly, that's not how TV's made. You put the Prime Minister there, you get an audience. We don't have the biggest budget. We're GBNews, we're a new channel. We've got very limited resources. We put out a show and we do our best. And what actually this is a bit like, could have been better here, guys. It's like, yeah, well, F off. It's live TV. It's not that easy. Like, a lot of it is just like, we did our best to make a TV show.
I know, yeah. A lot of, as you're right, a lot of their criticisms feel like kind of criticisms a TV critic might make rather than, you know, an impartial regulator. I mean, one of the criticisms was, you know, there were a broad enough range of views wasn't expressed. So, you know, I think maybe they have a point in that many of the criticisms seem to be the sorts of criticisms that people to the right of the Parliamentary Conservative Party and Rishi Sunak's government would make, rather than, you know, people who are planning to support Labour would make. But one of the reasons for that is they didn't vet the questions beforehand. They didn't know what questions were going to be asked. That was an editorial decision. They wanted there to be that element of spontaneity. No one knew what was coming, not least Rishi Sunak. But the presenter didn't know either. And that gave it, I think, a kind of spontaneity and a kind of danger that programs in which the questions have been vetted beforehand and you know there's going to be a broad range of questions which Ofcom's going to be happy with are less exciting, less interesting to watch. So that did feel like a kind of an editorial criticism rather than a regulatory point.
Yes, and I mean, the audience asked what they were going to ask, and I thought it was a key point there. Someone else said this to me on X, that there were criticisms from the right, and that's what really makes Ofcom uncomfortable. They don't want to hear that the public's actually far to the right of Rishi Sunak. They want to hear, and there was the LGBT person, but they want to hear loads of that. Why aren't you like obsessed with climate change? And you know, why is the ECHR amazing? And just like stuff like that. They don't want to hear like, we hate immigration and like, and by the way, I was vaccine injured. That's the last thing they want to hear. So that's what it really was. I think
Ofcom's criticisms of GBNews and the kind of ongoing criticism of GBNews, which is that, you know, it's a font of right-wing propaganda, which of course is nonsense. It's politically, you know, closer to the Telegraph than it is to Fox News. It's slightly right of centre, perhaps.
It's far left.
From your point of view,
we proved two things.
Well, I was going to make that point.
The Starmer thing.
So it was like people claiming that the Sun is an instrument of kind of Tory propaganda and was turned into one by Rupert Murdoch, who wanted the Tory government to do him favours and so forth. And then the discovery that actually a majority of Sun readers actually vote Labour. Ditto with GBNews, I think you were just going to say. I mean, there was that recent poll last month which found that more GBNews viewers were planning to vote Labour than Conservative or Reform.
Yes.
And I think the where Ofcom is going wrong and where the critics of GBNews are going wrong is in assuming that the audience are just these kind of credulous kind of receptacles who will just do whatever these propagandists on their kind of favourite TV station are telling them to do, which is nonsense. You know, people have agency. People don't do what they're told to do. All this kind of propaganda, if it is propaganda, kind of washes over their heads, and you know, it takes its part, and all kinds of other chorus of kind of influences and voices. The idea that they can be easily manipulated by these kind of evil far right kind of political masterminds is just for the birds.
That's such a blob midwit take. But the other thing is, according to Tom Harwood, GB tried to get Starmer first. They wanted Starmer just to be mouthing off on his own in a shirt.
Yeah.
So it would have been the same.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, maybe Starmer deliberately didn't do it to get them in trouble for DHS.
Yeah. Ofcom said to me when I spoke to them yesterday that had GBNew said at the end of the programme, and coming up, we're going to have a People's Forum with Keir Starmer. Tune in this time next week. Then they wouldn't be considering a statutory sanction. They probably wouldn't even found that there'd been a breach of the broadcasting code. But because they weren't able to say that, then it was more incumbent upon them to observe these other ways of being duly impartial.
It's not our fault that Starmer won't do it. It says here, GB News did not and was not able to include a reference in the programme to an agreed future programme in which an appropriately wide range of significant views on the major matter, weird writing, would be presented and given due weight. I don't know. So, we didn't get Starmer. It's not really our fault. Try and book Starmer. I mean, it's not that easy. He does it sometimes. I mean, he has done it. I saw him with Choppers the other day. It looked like he was interviewing Choppers, which was weird. He wasn't, just the way it was framed. But it's like Andrew Doyle all the time. Oh, you didn't get any women to talk about it. It's like, it's not that easy to book women on a show. We do our best. He's put together a show. People are they're sitting at home going, oh, it's not perfect. It's like quite hard to make live TV on a budget. Anyway.